Good afternoon, everyone. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Patsy Lewis, and I'm the director of the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies. And it's my pleasure to invite you to our last event for the academic year, a discussion on the book Education Across Borders, Immigration, Race, and Identity in the Classroom, which was published by Beacon Press this year. And we are delighted to have the book's co-authors, Dr. Jalene Temerat and Dr. Patrick Sylvan, in conversation with Dr. Andrea Flores. So this is a hybrid event, so we have some of you in the room. It's great to see you. And welcome to those of you who are following by Zoom or following the webinar. I will start by introducing Dr. Flores, and the format of this event is that she will speak to the book and then she'll engage in a discussion with the authors, and then she'll open up the floor for questions and comments from those of us in the audience. Andrea Flores is a cultural anthropologist who specializes in the anthropology of education. Her research interests primarily center on how education shapes immigrant and immigrant descendants' sense of self, transitions to adulthood, and social belonging in the United States. Her book, The Succeeders: How Immigrant Youth Are Transforming What It Means to Belong in America, identifies how Latino youth who participated in a college readiness program in Nashville, Tennessee, conceptualized the value of higher education for themselves, their families, and their communities in light of nativist hostility. Her next book project, Scientific Americans: Knowledge Migration in the Biological Century, investigates how foreign-born life science PhDs make migration and professional decisions following their graduate and or postdoctoral training in the United States. She is a member of the education faculty here at Brown University. Dr. Jalene Tamarat is the Dean of the Charles Sposato Graduate School of Education, a residency and master's program for aspiring teachers in the Boston area. Before coming to Sposato, she worked for 3 years as a director of new teacher development in Boston Public Schools, where she oversaw the district's introduction and licensure programs for novice teachers. She has served as adjunct faculty at Boston University, teaching methods courses to early career educators, as well as graduate level courses in adolescent development. She is currently a course instructor for the Center for Equity, Leadership, and Behavioral Health in schools at William James College. She began her career in education in 2003 as a classroom educator in Boston Public Schools, teaching core subjects such as science, mathematics, and social studies at the middle school level. She has published research and led professional development on various topics in education, such as critical consciousness development, global competence development, and funds of knowledge pedagogy. She is co-author, as we know, of the book being discussed today, Education Across Borders, Immigration, Race, and Identity in the Classroom. She holds a doctorate in education from Boston Universities, a master's in education from Harvard University, and an MAT from Emmanuel College, and a BA from the University of Massachusetts Amherst. Her co-author, Patrick Sylvan, recently completed his dissertation, Haiti and Being: Voodoo, Zombies, and the Plantation Continuum, to receive his PhD in English from Brandeis University. He specializes in global Black literature, critical race theory, colonial and decolonial theories, diasporic studies, realism, and political philosophy. He has taught at Brandeis, Brown University, and he has taught at our center, CLACS, as the inaugural Haitian language instructor, and he also served as a lecturer in Africana Studies, also here at Brown. He's also taught at Harvard, where he also served as the inaugural Haitian language coach in the African language program. And next year, he will serve as assistant professor in global, transnational, and post-colonial literature at Simmons University's Literature and Writing Department. He will also serve as a lecturer at Harvard, where he will be teaching a fall seminar on piracy, empire, and race. As a poet, writer, essayist, and educator, Sylvan has degrees from the University of Massachusetts, ABA, Harvard University, where he got his master's in education, and an MFA from Boston University. His poems have been nominated for the prestigious Pushcart Prize, and he's published in several anthologies, academic journals, books, magazines, and reviews, including African American Review, Acne, American Poetry Review, Callaloo, Chicago Quarterly Review, Plowshares, Prairie Schooner, Transition, and the Caribbean Writer. So we have a very distinguished panel. Thank you to you guys, and I'm really looking forward to this. I'll turn over to Dr. Flores.
So thank you all for being here today, and I have the great honor and privilege to introduce the work, Education Across Borders, Immigration, Race, and Identity in the Classroom, and to begin our conversation with two of its authors, Dr. Sylvain and Dr. Temerat. Yes, okay. So this book is an important one. It accomplishes what many try and few achieve. It connects the ever-present legacies of slavery, colonialism, and what your co-author, Marie-Lily Sarrat, calls, quote, the consistent man-made and natural disasters of the last 6 decades of Haitian history with the probing insights of Haitian youth, the pedagogical creeds of remarkable educators, including the two next to me today, and practical classroom strategies to transform Haitian, Dominican, and I would say all students' educations in the process of, as Patrick, as you put it, self-elevation and self-revolution. So if you can't tell from my opening remarks and all these colorful hedgehogs here, I loved this book, and I will be teaching this book. So for those of you in the audience who haven't had the chance to read it yet, and copies are for purchase outside the door, let me give you a brief overview. The book is a series of 4 masterfully crafted essays. Put together, they read as a holistic account of primarily Haitian youth's educational experiences, the socio-political and cultural circumstances in Haiti, the Caribbean, and the U.S. that shape these young people's educations and reception as young Americans, and what education that is truly liberatory can look like practically. The first essay by Patrick traces his own educational journey from a green card holding Haitian student in the 1980s who encountered among his classmates what the variety of the Haitian immigrant experience was at that point in time to a teacher and poet today. Through Patrick's essay, we see the challenges, change makers, and opportunities he and other Haitian students like and unlike him encounter in the process of schooling or being schooled. The essay traces a lived vision of education as liberatory and the educator as, quote, a holistic pedagogue, one who can awaken talents, foster dreams, push for meaningful characteristics of each pupil to be applied to practice as well as to life situational circumstances. Patrick's essay charts not only his educational world, but the possibilities for our world when educators see their students in terms of their civic and social capabilities. The next chapter by your missing co-author, Marie-Lily, is entitled Tell All the Others Our Story, and amplifies the voices of the Haitian high schoolers she worked with in New York. The chapter chronicles both the recent history of Haiti, from Francois Papadoc Duvalier through the devastation of Hurricane Matthew in 2016, with the more intimate histories of how Haitian youth in New York public schools managed rampant anti-Haitian sentiment fueled by the perception of Haitians linked to HIV in the 90s, and more recently by Trump's labeling of Haiti as a shithole country. One such way was to go undercover as non-Haitians to avoid stigmatization in their schools and communities. Into this context, Marie Lily shares the insightful perspectives of the youth with whom she worked, who proudly assert their Haitian identity and incisively critique their schooling. From history curriculums that leave out enslaved Haitian resistance to the global institution of slavery, or those who fail to make use of Haitian oral traditions in the teaching of things like figurative language. When I've taught teacher candidates in our MAT program here at Brown, it can be hard for them to imagine how to make curriculum reflective of students' worlds, and in particular for folks who are teaching in the sciences or in math. But in Marie Lily's chapter, we read that students themselves have the answers. For example, Caroline, a ninth grader, articulated how to use Vevey diagrams to plot graphs in math. Right? She had the answer of how she could bring her Haitian identity to her schooling and how that would help understand the process of graph plotting, which I still do not understand. Marie Lily concludes with a list of policy recommendations for how to make schools better for students. And while these are critical, it's her last line that stands out. Quote, "Let's hope that America listens to the stories of all its children, children like Caroline, who could teach her teacher a thing or two." The next chapter by our other guest today, Dr. Tamarat, skillfully takes us through the academic debates around funds of knowledge, culturally relevant, culturally sustaining, and reality pedagogies, and the concept of the third space, to get us to the point of it all. How do we value our Haitian and Dominican students and help to guide them on their own path to self-elevation and self-revolution? Drawing from her own experience as an educator in Boston Public Schools and her doctoral research within the district, she pulls out the funds of knowledge these students possess: family orientation, adaptability, self-sufficiency, transnationalism, multilingualism, and communalism. These funds are assets, even if they come from the difficulties of migration. While lengthy familial separations are common in both the Haitian and Dominican communities and are often seen by educators and researchers alike as potentially stumbling blocks to student growth, Jalinet asks us to see how adaptability also comes through separation. But again, beyond advocating for merely an orientation to asset-based funds of knowledge approaches to teaching, Jalinet gives the gift of her practices, in particular in the form of a survey she uses to get to know students. And again, I'll return to my own teaching of aspiring teachers and master's degree candidates. I'm often asked, how do you get to know your students? How can I do this without being intrusive or without undertaking an ethnographic research project, right, in my spare time? Jalinet shows us that asking, and just as importantly, answering gentle prompts like, what is something you know how to do really well that you learned how to do outside of a school setting? We can know our students and their funds of knowledge, and in the process make, as she states, quote, make the classroom a space for transformative learning. Finally, Patrick concludes by taking us out to the macro-historical level, asking us to consider how slavery, colorism, anti-Blackness, colonialism, and racism become embedded in structures of citizenship that perpetuate injustice for Haitians in Haiti, the Dominican Republic, and the U.S. Here we get to the biggest piece of education as liberation, as we see that, quote, colonial stigmas are forever present in the psyche and embedded in the cultural dynamics of 21st century free and postmodern humans. These humans are in our classrooms. Going from Jalinet's micro context of the classroom to this striking social analysis of the long history of racialized citizenship politics in the Americas broadly reminded me of something from Patrick's first chapter, and why we can't ignore these broader contexts when thinking about teaching immigrant or minoritized students. As he states, quote, a classroom is an integrated site of knowledge that has societal issues operating within it. This book itself is an integrated site of knowledge, one that provides its readers with a powerful primer on Haitian politics and anti-Blackness, but also shows how these powerful social orders ever present in our classrooms can be contested by reflective educators and their students. It is a tremendous resource for anyone thinking of going into teaching, which I know some of you in here today are, and for anyone interested in anti-racist education, and ultimately for all of us as we build a better world and move towards our own self-revolution. I want to say thank you both for writing it.
Well, thank you.
And for all of you that may be familiar with reading Rainbow when at the end when they would say, but you don't have to take my word for it. You don't have to today. We are very lucky to have Patrick and Jalane here with us. And I'm going to begin with some questions I had, and then we'll take your questions from the audience. So I was struck when reading the book about thinking about the relationship between students and teachers. And you both kind of talk about these trusting, caring, and formative relationships that you advocate as important for education. And I want to particularly talk about the racial politics of those relationships. Patrick, in the first essay, you so lovingly state that you embody the aspirations of a very influential Haitian teacher you had at Cambridge Religion Latin School in Massachusetts, but you also talk through the challenges of intra-group class divisions and colorism that Haitian educators at a school you later taught at. And Jalane, you talk through as a person of color, you were able to form some connections with your Dominican and Haitian students, and also that you had traveled there and had have a spouse from there. But also how you had to really endeavor to build that knowledge and sense of connection with Chinese students you had. So what advice do you both have for educators of color and white educators as they navigate their intersectional identities and those of their students in forging these relationships that we know are so important?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for a wonderful reading of the book and your questions. And thank you so much, Clarks, Dr. Lewis, for inviting us. Your question is extremely important. As we know, the United States is going through an educational crisis. And I would say the world, not the world at large, because certain countries do have it more organized than others. And I'm thinking sort of Norway, the Norwegian countries. But it's a challenge for third world, especially places that have experienced slavery. And of course, as a slave-owned and capitalistic society, the US is, education, which should be primer, unfortunately, it's not. And as we are sort of seeing the so-called cultural wars, education is being affected. So in a sense, I have to ask myself whether or not the former colonizers, those descendant from colonialism, whether or not they are interested in securing liberatory or at least critical education, right, for the advancements of a society. So in my own case, when I arrived in the United States, it was a time in which, and still Haitians were being labeled and coming from sort of relatively well-educated, somewhat easy background, right, socially speaking, I was able to maneuver very quickly and to understand the American system when my other Haitian students did not. For some of them, it was the first time they're seeing white people. It's the first time they're interacting with white folks. And, you know, whereas sort of from my class background, whites and mulattoes, so I hate that term, we interface with them. So I had some kind of a knowledge, and other forms of knowledge to understand Americanness, right, required a different kind of I guess, maneuvering. And some of my teachers really helped me, to understand the American dynamics, but also the importance of education within an American framework, which is very different than a French education and very different than a Caribbean or Haitian-based education, right? For those of us who are from the Caribbean, we know that your parents will tell you education, 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 and education, right? There's no negotiation. And sometimes even the person might not know how to read and write, but will pretend to know how to read and write so that you're doing the work. So for me, it became that, right? And when, sort of I formed and became president of the Haitian Club, it was about representation. And it still, even I have a former student here from Brown, even when I came to Brown, it's always about putting the students first, right? And constantly learning from my students. Even today, I'm always learning. So it became part of, I guess, the way I was raised, the relationship between, I guess, politics, decolonization, and also decentering of my maleness as the so-called, sort of authority figure, right? Because I come from a dictatorial country. Thus, those of us who are from dictatorship, the potential of you being a dictator is there, unfortunately, right? So you have to really work on shedding that, and working in terms of embracing and embedding democracy. And for me, education is about embedding and transferring, living, practicing by praxis the democratic values. And I end there.
Right. Well, thank you for that important question. So as Patrick, both spoke to his personal experiences, but also kind of spoke about teaching and embodying liberatory practices in the classroom from a more global, national even perspective. I'd like to kind of zoom in again and bring it down to the classroom level and even kind of further narrow my perspective down to like what exactly teachers who derive from, any racial, cultural, ethnic background need to remember and keep in mind as they're considering teaching and as they're working with students of color and really any students in particular, and who are, really concerned with the potential for liberation that education presents us. I think one of the things that we don't, as a teacher preparer like you are, I think that one of the things that we don't give enough attention to or place enough importance on is the necessity to explore the self, like understand yourself and understand your reason for being as it relates to your role as a teacher. I think that too often, and many teacher prep programs are guilty of this, we believe that there is a standard for teaching that people need to kind of meet, and that doesn't like take into account the funds of knowledge really that teachers may bring to the classroom space. I was revisiting Bell Hook's Teaching to Transgress recently, and in her first chapter, she talks about, as a precondition for liberatory teaching practice, A, healing needs to happen, and B, self-actualization, right? And so as people are entering the teacher workforce, I think that it's an imperative that we encourage them and really require them to do the introspection necessary to understand, A, who they are from an identity perspective, from a beliefs perspective about themselves, their agency, and what their students want and need, and how to get that information from their students and the communities that they're working with, particularly if they're not from those communities, and really unpack that. If you don't understand why you're there and you're just there to kind of fit into a role that is prescribed for you and really doesn't do enough of a job of exploring kind of what the students need and what the potential that you have as the teacher can contribute to that, or even, and understanding whether that aligns with what you actually believe about yourself and why you're there, then there's a problem. And that self-actualization is not just knowing yourself, but it's fulfilling like what you're meant to do in this world, right? What are your gifts? What are your talents? What are the things that you bring that can edify your teaching, your teaching and your identity as a teacher, your role as a teacher? And I think that, I'm very aligned with Bell Hooks in kind of presuming that. Like that is, if you're going to do liberatory practice, you have to not only know your community and be committed to liberation, but also just understand your why. And if you can't communicate at a very deep level your why, then you really don't have in my opinion, you don't have a place in the classroom. And it can be particularly harmful if those explorations aren't done when you are, not of the community, regardless of your race. But in particular, like if you are not BIPOC and you're working with minoritized students, that's a problem.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes what I notice too is students are thinking through like, oh, well, you're this and I'm this, but not doing the full work like you're talking about, Patrick, that like you may have a different class background or you may have a different set of educational experiences. And that I think there's sometimes an assumption when I see teacher candidates talking to each other, well, you're Latinx or you're Black, so you'll understand those students, without us understanding that those identities for those teachers is just as complicated and different than their students, right? We shouldn't just assume that there's a magical power that comes with being a BIPOC educator, right? That everyone has to do this work. Right? So we've established that this book is going to help my teaching, right, in my classes. But I'm going to pose another question to you that comes up from candidates that I've had before. That how do we kind of make sure that we avoid kind of a linguistic imperialism, right? Where it's like we have Spanish speakers and Chinese speakers here, and that's who we're going to talk to, and folks who speak Kurdish or speak Haitian language, right? Like what do we do with them, right? So how do we balance serving the few with serving the many in a limited, in the limited education system that we have in the United States?
You're doing a great
I'm happy to share my thoughts on that. I one of the things, and I believe I touch on it in the chapter, but one of the things that I've definitely written about in other spaces is the fact that culture is fluid, it's nuanced. And one of the things that I caution against when it comes to funds of knowledge pedagogy is making broad assumptions about groups of students based on their group identities. If you are going to do funds of knowledge pedagogy or engage in really any kind of culturally responsive pedagogical practice, it's imperative that you, as the teacher, take the time to develop your understandings of who those students are on an individual and a very deep level. It's not enough to say, okay, the student is from Haiti and therefore ... Because as Patrick highlighted before, his experience as a Haitian immigrant was different in some ways from the experience of some of his peers and some of his later students as Haitian immigrants. And so, and with the advent of it's not even advent at this point, but with the presence of the internet and social media in today's day and age, like culture is even more fluid and nuanced than ever. When I was working as a classroom teacher in Chinatown for, it was 8 years at this school, about a third of the student population were Black and brown, but not Chinese American. And they had, very deep understanding of Chinese culture that was kind of like integrated or, layered on top of their own cultural understandings that they brought relating to their own kind of national backgrounds. And so, with, exposure and opportunities to be exposed to other cultures, whether it's, American culture or, Korean culture, Mexican culture, whatever, there is much more exposure through social media, through the internet that students have in our schools today. And so it's really important to kind of tap into people and their understandings on an individual basis, or else you're not fully understanding them.
I mean, I will add sort of within the political framework that we tend to want a single narrative, right? It's easier. Quite often when people say to me, well, this person speaks Chinese, I'm like, no, there's no such thing as Chinese. Either Cantonese or Mandarin and so forth and so on. But we want to make things very simple, right? But at the same time, while the world has always been the same size and the world seems smaller, we have to keep in mind that there is such a thing as a linguistic warfare. Okay, there's a linguistic warfare. It's been going on for a long time. French versus German, right? In both philosophy and linguistically speaking, wanting to see which one would replace Latin, right? Which one would be sort of like the dominant language in Europe. And of course, English was not even in the game. Of course, now English is the language, and a lot of people are resistant to it, right? And particularly in France and so forth. So language brings with it not just knowledge, but also there is empire behind language. And we see sort of China is moving into Africa. A lot of African countries are learning Mandarin, and of course, within China there is linguistic warfare between Mandarin and Cantonese, and of course, different dialects. So we need to really think about the issues of linguistic imperialism, right? And how language plays in an important part, right, within the national discourse. We could think of English as well. And, we're from Boston. Those of you who've been to Boston, you know that the Boston accent is really bad. And of course, the middle America is the so-called standard English accent, right? So even here, right, there is a kind of linguistic warfare which we don't pay attention to. And so who is able to speak the language, the normative language? Right? And then on the wider scale, which language do we consider normative? Which language do we consider smart? Right? If you speak French, automatically speaking, oh, you must be classy and je ne sais quoi, whatever. Are there illiterate French? Yes. So is the French the language of knowledge, or is knowledge simply something that is fundamental to human living and acquisition, but in which we simply express through language, right? Haiti is still going through major problems when most Haitians do not speak French. But yet the government insists on maintaining French as the national language. Alienation. And that happens in terms of so many countries that were colonized, right? The United States solved that. Supposedly solved it, right? Because there are issues in terms of inner city languages in which we call Ebonics or others, right? Because we still want to maintain standard English. And of course, with the increased Spanish-speaking population passing supposedly laws in order to ban bilingual education, but also banning the presence of Spanish-speaking folks, which we tend not to remember. It was done in the 1950s for German speakers. So there was a kind of history in terms of whose language we want to keep sort of maintain as the normative language, and how certain societies become, in a sense, threatened by the other's language. Right? So for me, I would say that for a teacher, when you have a student in your classroom, particularly if they are Asians or from Latin America, don't simply assume you know them, right? Because in Guatemala, there are so many different languages. Spanish is not the language of Guatemala. There are so many other languages, but Spanish is an official language, is the language of power. Try to understand the language of power versus the language of the people. Those two might be very different, right? Then you get an understanding in terms of who your students are and how to communicate with them. And sometimes the kind of knowledge, the funds of knowledge that Jalen is talking about, they might not be able to express something in Spanish, but they might be able to express it in Kichakil, for example, or whatever other sub-languages within a particular country. So I hope I answered your question. And I went for a while. But
That's great. I have other questions, but let's open it up for discussion.
And if you ask a question, please just use one of the microphones. I can bring it over to you for our online.
Thank you so much for being here with us today and for sharing this book. I'm really looking forward to reading it. And I guess just to preface my question, my background is in feminist pedagogy. It was a huge part of my graduate training. And so I think for me, one of the ways that I've been most successful in my classrooms is when like I am able to like give up power and like meaningfully engage in conversation, which is like not all the time. It's like a very sometimes thing because so all of my examples of teaching have been people who like hold on to the power and don't let it go. So I was kind of wondering if you could speak to that, of like strategies for like accessing that thing that I've been successful at like sometimes, but not all the time. And how people who are in classrooms like across race and across nationality can like loosen the hold on that power.
I think relationships is key. If you have strong relationships with the students where you have come to an understanding of the goals of your time together, these are the things that are of course of interest to the students, but like these are the things that I also know are important that I want to like make sure that that you engage in so that you are prepared to be a fully participatory kind of like an informed person in this world. If you're able to establish that, like through strong relationships, through dialogue, through inquiry, that's bidirectional, then I think that it becomes easier to engage in the practices and run a classroom that is not so kind of constrictive and like, I mean, of course, you'll always have the hierarchy that's there, but not so hierarchical that the students don't have voice and don't feel like they are partnering with you to kind of drive the learning in the classroom. The other thing that is important to consider is that, there's also a lot of movement that needs to be made when it comes to school leadership. And I think that we're not at the point yet where a majority of both teachers and leaders in school and like the population in general has an understanding that just because a classroom is silent doesn't mean it's productive. And just because a classroom seems a little, noisier or like more chaotic, excuse me, on its face, it doesn't mean that productive learning isn't happening. I found that, the most dynamic spaces, the most kind of like engaged classrooms are the ones that, the kids are moving about. They're talking to each other. They're talking to the teacher. They are, it's not out of control, but the students have a lot of agency over their learning and over their bodies, over their voices. Like they are able to be in the work and not feel as though they're having to comply. This is something that they want to do because they believe in the project.
And I'll add two things. I mean, I completely agree with what Janet just said. You have to ask yourself whether you're a gatekeeper or a transformative teacher. If you're a transformative teacher, you will let go of power, right? I mean, and that's its ongoing process. If you're a gatekeeper, then, well, you know your role. And then you have to ask yourself, are you comfortable with that role? Because you're going to have to really do the introspection.
And can I just go back to one thing that I think I was about to say, that consider the the context that you're teaching in, the school context, right? Because if the leadership of the school and your teacher colleagues at the school are not kind of aligned in understanding that like this method of teaching and learning that kind of you're engaging in the classroom is not going to be the silent class where the kids, can only speak with permission, where you're just kind of transferring information and knowledge to them. Like if they don't understand that that's not the teacher that you are or aspire to be, like it's not going to be a comfortable place for you. And they will likely not appreciate what you're doing. And so as you're kind of thinking about schools where you are considering working in, you want to make sure that you have a philosophical and practical alignment with the school there. And, it can be hard to kind of like sniff that out at the beginning, but I think it's really important.
And I'll just add, the book is so great about highlighting the work that you both do, but also the folks that you talked with in your research, and Patrick, the folks that you've worked with, and kind of how that plays out. Like you really get a sense in the book of like what those spaces look like.
Yeah.
Other questions?
So there's one question from our Zoom audience. This is from Alisa, who asks, does the book address the differences in the experience of legal versus illegal immigrants?
Not really. I tried, at least for me, and Johnny could have addressed her essay. For me, although I had illegal students, but it was not about legality versus illegality, because the students in my classroom, they were present, and I really did not care about their legal status, right? And so therefore, it was not up to me to really write about their personal lives. And I have stories for books, but I think that would be a violation of trust. And so therefore, no.
Yes, and in my chapter, I make a brief mention of some of the added traumas that undocumented students can, in particular, have while navigating their, this country and classrooms with that designation or that status. But like Patrick says, that is something that if inquired about, sometimes can place the students' status and livelihood in jeopardy. And so as a practice, as a classroom teacher, that is not something that I made a point of specifically asking about. It's kind of an unspoken thing that comes up if it comes up. And if it does, okay. And we'll kind of keep this between us. But and even in my work with aspiring and new teachers, it's not something that is part of the Funds of Knowledge pedagogy that I think should really be targeted as for inquiry.
Well, I will say that your last chapter, Patrick, does talk about these kind of global regimes of citizenship and how we think about this as a construct, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that one that's deeply raced and a product of colonialism in many senses. And so I think there we also see when you're talking, both of you are talking about liberatory education that fulfills these, democratic ideals. Part of it is unpacking these narratives of citizenship that are fundamentally exclusionary, right? And so I think that that's kind of a lovely thing in the book, is that it's there, but I think you treat these issues with such respect. That's important. Sorry, I'm not supposed to be talking.
No, well said, well said.
I know you're not shy. I know some of you out there.
I can read your eyes. But I still can read your eyes.
Thank you. You mentioned a little bit that people in their different countries have different education and different styles of education that they grow up with and then come to the United States and have a different system, a different education system. So is there any role for the teachers, the educators in the United States to know more about the education system, how it works in other countries before you start working with students who have that background?
Can I tell you about a dream of mine? There is nothing that I would love more than to take teachers on trips to understand better the home countries of their students, and really just understand the world more deeply and understand how education, not just how education happens in other places, but just broaden their global perspective. I know that in the United States, we live in a pretty cosmopolitan city, but even within Boston or, some of these, like international hubs here in the United States, I would say the majority of teachers, don't really know a whole lot about the world and especially about how education happens in the world. They haven't, unfortunately, we live in a very insular kind of society. As Americans, we are not encouraged really to think that there's anything or any place that's as important as the United States, and I think that really is a disservice to all of us. We ought to be in our K-12 schools really infusing our curriculum with the global perspective, but before that can even happen, our teachers need to understand the world. They have to have a global perspective. And it's just not a priority for a lot of policymakers, a lot of us, to be quite frank with you. So I think it's really important. It's important for teachers to understand where their students are coming from. And the best way to do that is to have those international experiences where you're really ensconced in those localities. You have opportunities to become culturally immersed and also visit schools and engage in professional sharing with your counterparts abroad. Understand what are the complexities of education in various locations. It will only benefit all of us if we did that.
I mean, I would add, I remember we took a trip to Singapore after we received sort of fellowship. And Singapore is a place I love, their educational system and everything else. And we learn so much, right? So traveling becomes extremely important. But I think first and foremost, you have to ask yourself, again, if you are an American, are you an essentialist? In other words, you're saying that America is number one. No other places matter. I don't really care about other places. You come here, you learn my culture. I don't really care. Well, you're not going to be a good teacher. I can tell you that much. So I remember the first time I had a Korean student. I had never had Korean students before. I went and learned about Korea in order to relate, right? Because it's about relationship. Okay. And I have to understand my students. I have to understand, for example, I had another student from Puerto Rico who refused to learn English. Absolutely. And I'm like, okay. Some of the teachers at that school thought she had a neurological problem. And I'm like, no, there's something else going on. We became friends. She said, I will say something to you in English. She said, Mr. Sylvan, I understand English. What it was resistance. She did not like the U.S. and she, in a sense, read the U.S. as a colonizer. She was 100% Puerto Rican, okay? And resisted speaking English. It was an act of resistance. Now, people from other places, India, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, for example, do you know the difference in whether or not they are Sikh versus Muslim versus Hindu? And all those things will make a big difference, right? So you have to know your students and not to make generalizations and categorization, and to really think and zoom in on the individual as an individual, right? And then that also enriches your knowledge, who you are as a teacher, if you become much more open and global, right? It's about, again, enriching yourself in order to know your students.
Given that it's unrealistic to think that people are going to get that kind of exposure, what strategies would you use in the classroom to bring that varied experience?
I mean, I would say, especially if you are teaching literary arts, diversify your curriculum, right? Read different stories. Don't do just a simple, well, wear your cultural garb and it will eat your food and that's it. Diversity, bravo. No, right? Immerse, couple weeks, right? Focus on Korea. Sort of, a few weeks, focus on Australia and other places. But that would allow, as Jalani said, depending on the leadership of the school. Right? They might not want for you to have this kind of open and very diversified curriculum, because they might want for you to teach to the test. So it depends on the school culture. But I would say if you could still teach to the test, but still bring in other books, right, as supplementary material, do it.
Yeah, I mean, if there isn't the political will, the financial kind of backing, or other opportunities or opportunities for teachers to travel abroad, as Patrick was saying, like I for my entire life, I've been an avid fiction reader, and it has just really just. I've always been drawn to global literatures, and having opportunities to read fiction that takes place, historical fiction, modern fiction set in modern times, that take place in other societies, other countries, that's enriched my understanding so much of what life is like on a very kind of deep level through the characters in other countries. We also have the great resource of the internet. We can easily kind of, have access to understanding anything that we want to about anything. And so I think that, if people don't independently want to read the books or want to, do the online research, then it would make a lot of sense to me to build professional development that is targeted on building teachers' global perspectives. And so, you could have opportunities to focus on specific parts of the world. And then from there, I think to another one of Patrick's points, in terms of exposing students to the world and building them towards global competence, where they're able to think about and act on global issues. Interdisciplinary study is key. So if you're, administering professional development to teachers that are, centered on global education, have these teacher groups be professional learning communities and be on the same grade level team, so that they can create interdisciplinary lessons where students are going to go deep into the content. So if you have a lesson on water scarcity, you read, have the students read a story, fiction, nonfiction, about kind of how this is playing out in a certain part of the world. And then in their math classes, grapple with statistics relating to, maybe it's comparatively looking at that part of the world versus some other countries. You explore it from a historical perspective in history or social studies classes. And, art classes, like all of it kind of like aligning and coming together to give students a very deep understanding of like this issue in this particular context so that they really understand this challenge in this part of the world. And I think that can happen through professional development and curriculum development.
Yeah, and again, to plug the book, I think that this book really is this is what makes it so wonderful, right? Is that you can read this book and you understand this kind of whole perspective, right? To understand the deep histories in this part of the world, how that's manifesting among students, but also that students are individuals, right? And teachers are individuals. And we need to balance that sense of knowledge and not essentialize, but also still, pulling both, right? Like, I don't know. We had a DJ workshop recently, and it was like, okay, put the registers up. Like, is it this kid or is it called? It's that balance.
Yeah.
Okay. Can we have another question?
Oh, hello.
Yeah.
Okay, hi. My name is Tasvia. I have a question. I've been thinking about how to word it, so let's see if I make sense. So, I think what you say matters because it shapes the way students interact with teachers and teachers interact with students, but also the ways that students interact with other students. And so, these problems and challenges are exacerbated, I think, in higher ed, where there's even more limitations to access, where there's less diversity, where there is more privilege, among students and greater disparity as a result, right? So we talked about Americanness, and part A of my question is, how do we quantify or qualify Americanness? Because
Where's the other mic?
there is a very legitimate. I can project.
It doesn't go through to the people online. I'm sorry.
Hello. Okay, so part A is how do you qualify? And I mean, I don't even know if you do, but there is this qualifying or quantifying of Americanness that happens in the classroom that separates certain students from others, right? And B, how do students who may have grown up in the US and have like linguistic power, how do we show up in better ways for students who might not have those capabilities, who may not have citizenship status, who may not have bilingual access or only speak one language, can't really speak or read in the way that students who grew up in the States have.
You're asking a $1 million question. So here we are at Brown, an Ivy League, a corporation. The endowment went up $7 billion recently. And so Brown as a university, just like all the other universities, the goal is to educate, change the world, the research and so forth and so on. But quite often the problem that you find in places like Brown or Harvard is that the education for transformation is shouldered by Africana Studies Department, sort of education and other, right? Sort of the so-called minorities who are supposed to almost like bring humanity, right, to those places. So that's the dilemma. But at the same time, we cannot really change the overall capitalistic culture where the public schools overall are failing students, and you have to go to private schools paying tons of money, building social capital in order to be in this pipeline that will get you to the Ivy Leagues. And the Ivy Leagues, of course, will get you to the Senate, the corporations. You see, it's cyclical, right? How do we break that? Can we break that? I don't know. But while we're here, whether it's at Brown or wherever else, is try to remain as humanly possible human, caring about your students, your colleagues, and to maintain your purpose, right? In other words, don't sell your souls. And I remember reading a book many, many years ago about, Harvard students not having souls, right? Because they're sold their souls. And I remember the first time I came here to teach, one of the things that was repeated to me over and over is that Harvard students, they mess up the world and Brown students do fix it, right? That's a kind of the myth. That's the myth, right? And so it's the myth. But I think regardless of where you are, it's to really stay focused in terms of your liberatory practices. Remain true to who you are without selling yourself short, right? In other words, what I'm saying is always maintain your sanity, okay? Because it could be very easy to lose yourself because you are so frustrated by the system, or you are so frustrated by the problems in which your students are bringing into the classroom. Try to maintain a balance so that you don't bring those problems home. And perhaps Jalande could talk more about that. This is where you get teacher burned out.
Yeah. Yes. And I think, in the higher ed space, as Patrick was talking about how this work is shouldered by, whether it's an Africana Studies department or a school of education. Like for the school of education in particular, I think that if that's the responsibility that's being shouldered, there's a lot of opportunity there because you are developing prospective educators, right? A lot of times, and if not educators, people who will have influence on the education systems. And so I think that it's actually a good place to start by looking at teacher education programs, looking at policy, coursework, and really, I think about my own kind of all of the schooling that I've done. Like, I didn't have much coursework at all, and much discussion that focused on liberatory practice in the classroom. And of course, this was during, at a different time when it wasn't really talked about as much. But I think that there's an opportunity here. We are at a critical juncture kind of in our educational kind of trajectory and our nation's kind of trajectory at this point. And we're at a point where if we don't embrace liberatory practice, if we don't prioritize it, I think that the K-12 system is going to come crumbling down. And from there, it's just a domino effect. And so to the extent that teachers or prospective teachers can be prepared to kind of enter the teacher workforce with a different perspective around kind of what it means to be a teacher, around the importance of liberation, not just as, not just for liberation, for liberation's sake, but because it's going to be a matter of our survival as a society. I think that if we can embrace that and start to kind of build that into our teacher prep spaces, that's going to help move the needle a little bit. Now, to the other part of your question that talked about the challenges that we can sometimes experience, being, maybe, you can be a person of color or someone who cares about these issues deeply, but was born or, raised here in the United States, or, just being a small segment of your, or being part of a small segment of your undergraduate or graduate population here at the school that is from a minority background. And it's not minority really anymore if you look at minorities collectively. it can definitely take a toll, psychologically, emotionally, etc. And so I think that just as in K-12 schools right now, we are starting to hear more about the importance of social emotional learning, healing, etc. Like that also, you both can probably also speak to this. Our students at the higher ed level are also, like, we're all struggling right now. We all need the spaces where we can connect with, people who kind of share, some aspect of our identities. But, even like if we're not talking about affinity spaces per se, like just across the board, like people are in need of significant healing. And so like that's something else that needs to be built into not just like practices that kind of address that need to be built into not just our K-12 schools, but also in our colleges and universities. Because the evidence is out there, people are having struggles, and it's getting in the way of their ability to contribute, to self-actualize, to be themselves and survive this time.
Do we go until 1 or 1:30? I don't remember.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah.
Can they hear me or no?
Thank you.
So both of you have expressed or explained your pedagogical training being non-hierarchical, relational, and decolonial. In a digital information age, how will the educational institution distinguish itself in the next 10, 20, or 30 years?
Well, I will just say that I don't believe that my training was non-hierarchical. Like I actually experienced what most people, I think, who like, at least I'm Gen X, so like most Gen Xers experience, which is very hierarchical. And actually I'll qualify that by saying like my 7 to 12 experience was definitely hierarchical and less so at the Afrocentric elementary school that I went to. But time will only tell. I mean, if you had asked me 15, 12 years ago, even kind of if our lives, our collective lives would be so centered around like smartphones and connectivity, like I wouldn't believe it. I think that there's a lot of potential for both kind of like enrichment and like positive evolution as there is for like destructive evolution, both in educational spaces, but also like within society. And I think that, one of the, like, there's a lot that we can do to enhance teaching and learning, like through the use of technology. But I think that we have to understand, and a lot of work needs to be done to explore like the most effective uses of it in classroom spaces. I know that right now, whenever I visit K-12 classrooms, and even in higher ed spaces sometimes, the cell phones are not effectively like integrated into the curriculum or pedagogy, but they are there. And they're a distraction for students. Like they are gravitating towards, the phone. Many of us are addicted to our phones. Like I'm addicted to certain things on my phone, and it's hard to put them down. And for kids who have grown up with this technology, it's even harder for them to not gravitate towards it. And so I think we as the adults have to come to an understanding of what the reality is. The reality is that this technology is not going to go away. Our kids are going to continue using it. And so what are the opportunities that we have to use this technology for good and to enhance and deepen learning that happens? I think that we are, currently we're using outdated modes of instruction, of outdated materials. the attention spans aren't there anymore. The interest isn't there anymore in kind of like, books. I mean, this is just, I know we're talking about a book right now. But, we have to, I don't know what it's going to look like, but I think that if we don't incorporate the use of technology effectively, and we don't come to an understanding of like its potential for both enhancement and destruction, like I think society will feel the repercussions of this, but it will become palpable in the K-12 classroom space as well.
I mean, I'll say briefly, it is a very important question. And I don't know if you remember, Colleen, when you were here, there was a movement to digitize John Carter Brown's library, because John Carter Brown has the second largest repository of Haitian materials up until 1825. And those materials, you could not return them to Haiti because they don't have the archival capabilities. There's issues of heat and, of course, what belongs to empire and so forth and so on. A lot of places have made those texts available through the internet, right? So in a sense, the internet, most of my research were done through the internet. Books that I would have to travel to Vancouver, I could simply download. Great. But at the same time, so the positive side, you also have places in certain remote areas, whether the U.S. or different places, where they could get access to the internet. That is, if they have sort of a very fast internet access, which of course costs money. So we could think of the positive side. The negative side, and I felt it the first spring during COVID. My students, their screens one by one started to go dark. I had 20 students and I had 2 faces on the screen, and everything else and I had to do my best, right? How many of the students who were there? Don't know, right? So there is a kind of that frustration. The other frustrations I've heard from colleagues who dislike the fact that the students could have a smartphone and they could fact check while the professor is teaching. And they say, well, actually, Google said, whereas for me, I would say, well, if I don't know something, please Google it, let me know, right? So it's both positive and negative, and it really depends on how we integrate technology for good. And also, a lot of universities are insisting on having literacy, how to use technology, how to know what is factual, given the various manipulation, and you can tell me what's the word, fake bots, whatever they are, that are, it's a problem, right? It's both positive and negative. Yeah. Microphone.
I want to follow up on her question, because having had 2 children myself go through the school system, is it a necessary institution? I mean, just corralling all these young people at the height of their creativity and energy to just sit dully in these confined spaces, listening to somebody, following the pace of everybody else. It doesn't seem to me to be the most efficient way to deal with human beings. So as you think about how education might evolve, do you see the possibility, and learning off COVID, both the positives and negatives of, having children or not having children in a classroom space, do you think that we can actually evolve to a more natural way of teaching? And of course, one thing you didn't mention, you kind of mentioned it as the bots, but what is the source of your students fact checking you? I think that the whole question of how knowledge is generated, how you treat sources, how you differentiate, would have to be taught at a much earlier stage. We kind of leave that for higher, high school and
Right.
university. But I suspect that has to be something that
Yeah.
starts.
Yeah, so technological literacy definitely should be taught earlier. Definitely, and to your point, it's not. But in terms of like the question of whether schools as an institution is needed or how it might evolve, given the advancements in technology and the proximity that everyone right now has to technological resources. I think 2020 to 2021 or 22, whenever we started going back in person to school again, like that was the test, right? And so we could imagine what school that's not kind of located within a specific school building could look like. And I think that we've learned through that experiment that it works for some students, but not everyone. There are some students who will have the screens black or, will completely disengage for whatever reason because they need that social connection. And we all need social connection. So I think that for most students, like it's actually important that, even if we move to a world in which we're not using physical school buildings as the primary sites of education, like there still needs to be embedded opportunities for students to like interact with other people as part of the socialization process and also for their mental health. And so I personally am not an advocate for either model, like the one where we're at home on Zoom for 8 hours a day and or the model where we're in school and like still following this factory model of education that is persisting and and really is like, inhibiting to a large extent, the potential for liberatory practice. There may be some kind of a hybrid or, a happy medium that we could find, but when it comes to younger students, like I don't believe that our societal structures and our economy is set up to support that. For most people, school is childcare, and most adults have to work. And so until like labor shifts and our kind of practices around work and, the economy has to shift, like corporations, like businesses, commerce has to, like all of these things have to shift to be more tech-based and, provide remote opportunities for everyone, which right now is not something that's feasible because there's always going to be like someone who's an essential worker that, can't work from home and can't like work without schools. There's one other thing that I was going to say about this. Oh, the other thing that I do want to say is that, while schooling can't necessarily disappear, like schools necessarily can't disappear at this time, I think that there's a possibility that we need to explore of like getting people out of the buildings. I mean, we have like there's no reason that students need to be cooped up in a building for 180 days a year, and then, maybe at the end of the year you get a field trip or two. There are opportunities for experiential education that we just don't tap into. And I don't know if it's laziness or like if there's something else, but I don't know why. But a lot of times school, and I have experienced this as a K-12 student myself, it's confining. And it can also like like it's uncomfortable for me right now to like sit down for an entire day and like have to, like be in the same space and just kind of like be receiving information and not moving, not, being not more fully embodying the educational experience. And so like I definitely think that at all ages, like classrooms don't need to be the site of learning.
Quickly, I will simply add there's the issue, the legalistic aspect as well, right? Whether or not society is willing to let go of its not capacity, but desire to constantly be suing, right? Because this is why I think we are sort of confined within spaces in terms of who is responsible if there are any kind of accidents, for example, right? Liabilities, right? Given that this is such a legalistic society. So, I mean, I think, places like the Caribbean, we need to be out there. We need to be touching things. Farming, different, learning about the environment, the sea, everything else, and then move somewhere else where you could still do sort of other kind of learning. But I think the model is still a colonial educational model, unfortunately, that is deeply confined and geared towards industrialization, right? Because we are producing students to become workers.
Well, I had a question that I feel like now you've really kind of like derailed with that response. But both of you have like highlighted how the educational system for the last maybe 100, 150 years has been one that has been hierarchical or really centered on a discipline of information. So we know with the internet that anything is accessible now. That's why there's like a high number of folks that are really disengaged on Zoom. So what would you think, because we know we need like the education system, we need that format of having socialized centers of discipline. What do you think the education system has to look like beyond just being a discipline of information? Does it look like being a discipline of healing, like you had mentioned? I'm just curious what your thoughts are.
So I think it's a discipline of healing, discipline of cultivating citizenship and agency. And so if you can invite students to opportunities to explore, like to have, the substantive knowledge about the world, like understand how the world works, who are the key players, like what's happened historically, like, all of that. There's skills that need to be developed. So communication skills, when it comes to mathematics, maybe it's computational skills, things like that. All of these things ideally will inform your capacity to become like a fully engaged citizen, not just, locally or nationally, but like globally. And so like, I think that should be the primary aims of education, creating an informed and capable citizenry. And also, because we are social beings and we, enter these institutions, enter these spaces, that are part of a world that is contestuous and not healthy all the time. Like the schools have to be the place, or need to be a place where the healing can occur, the processing, the both like understanding the world, but also understanding yourself. And, the self-actualization that I spoke of before as it relates to teachers, like that's also important to start kind of at a very young level, at a very young age. What are you interested in? Like, how are you going to contribute to, the project of like humanity and like in evolution and creating the world. And schools ideally would be the place where these things happen.
And because of that, this is why the GOP, the Republicans, are marshaling deep control of the school system. That's all I'll say.
I mean, I think it's also, again, the title of your chapter, right? Democratic pedagogy and engaged citizenry. That's what we're talking. That's the stakes of schooling, right?
Exactly. And unfortunately, I mean, my politics, the GOP does not want a democratic and engaged citizenry. And it's not just the GOP. If you think of countries that are autocratic, they do not want a democratic and engaged citizenry.
But we also know about the school to prison
Pipeline,
Right.
exactly.
Well, regardless of whether it's the GOP or the Democratic Party, so there's
Right,
no
right.
structural problem.
Exactly, same structural problem, right. Yeah.
But I think this also gets to the point, right, of like what was the purpose of education? Why did we have these egg carton classrooms, right? And it was about disciplining, particularly immigrant bodies, right?
Yes.
At the turn, as we know about contemporary schooling now, right, at the turn of the 20th century, making this into a docile labor force, right? And so, I mean, this is the power of this book, is to say, what does it look like to undo that, right? What does it take from everyone to make this a space where our worlds can really be transformed? Well, I think I don't want to be the last word, though. So
No,
say
that's
something.
fine. That's fine. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having us.
All right. Let's thank our wonderful guests.
Okay, I'll have the last word. I just want to thank you all. This was a fascinating discussion, both to our authors, our moderator, book critic, and to our wonderful audience for this very rich discussion. I also want to acknowledge the third co-author, Marie Lily Surratt, who wasn't able to be here with us, but who is very well represented in this discussion today. I also want to acknowledge the support of the Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice in co-sponsoring this event. And I want to thank you all. I know that you're not all here, either online or in the room, who have supported us by attending on many activities, or too many activities, this past academic year. And to the Watson Institute, his communications team, in particular Alex, who is here today, Sam, John, Ellen, a large group of people who have supported us, provided technical and other support to us, to our CLACS in-house folks, Kate, who is Goldman, our center manager, Erica Durante, our director of undergraduate studies, our postdoctoral fellow, Kristen Collins, our Sawyer graduate proctor, Alexandria Miller, and all of our student or graduate and undergraduate students, assistants, the dean of faculty, Professor Ed Steinfeld, I almost said Ed Watson, director of the Watson Institute, and everybody who has supported us that I haven't mentioned. I just want to say a deep appreciation as we end our programming for the year. And thank you so much. I really enjoyed this discussion.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.